Kevin, it's great to have you here. Just really excited for the space. I'm going to be hanging out in the background and nerding out, and yeah, couldn't be more excited.
Sounds good. Let's get weird.
Sounds good. Cool. So let's kick things off. Welcome everyone to VDAO's monthly Twitter Spaces. For those of you that are joining for the first time, VDAO is a community of ecosystem builders at the intersection of the physical and the digital, and we're experimenting with regenerative network states. If you want to come and find out more, check out our community portal at vdao.io, or you can join our Discord, and the link to that is going to be shared in the comments on this Twitter space. So today we're really excited to welcome a true crypto OG, Gitcoin founder and Green Pill podcast host, Kevin Owocki. And as you may know, last year Kevin hosted Daniel Schmachtenberger, who's one of the leading voices in the Metacrisis movement, on his Green Pill pod. And Daniel really went into, in fact, I think it was multiple sessions on the Metacrisis, and he went into a lot of detail and introduced this whole topic to the Web3 community, which spun lots of discussions and yeah, so much conversation in the Web3 community. In the space today, we're going to revisit some of that, consider how things have gone since that podcast to now, and also consider, as a community of builders at this point, how do we respond to the meta crisis, both in Web3 and in the physical world? This topic's been a really kind of key, it's been a key theme within the V community since we launched earlier this year, and I'm really excited to dive into this today with Kevin. If you have any questions at all, drop them in the comments as we go. We'll see how much time we have at the end. If we have space, we'll bring people up and we can continue the conversation. And we'd also really appreciate it if everyone could retweet the spaces. Let's bring as many people as we can into the conversation. Cool. So before we kick off, I just want to take this opportunity to thank Kevin for taking the time out, because I know you're super busy and we really appreciate you coming to join us today. So thanks, man. And yeah, just to kick things off, I'm curious, like your podcast with Daniel was last year. A bit of time has gone by since then. I'm curious, like, what does this term meta crisis mean to you today?
Thanks so much for having me. Excited to be here. Excited to chat with y'all. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Kevin Owocki. I'm one of the co-founders of Gitcoin. Gitcoin is a crowdfunding platform and protocol that helps your community fund what matters to it. And we've been involved in the funding public goods and distributed collective action scene in the Ethereum space for the last 7 years or so. And that's been a lot of fun. But yeah, to directly answer your question, Chris, the Metacrisis is a term invented by Daniel Schmachtenberger and people associated with Daniel, and I sort of summarize it as the sum totality of all the different crises that humanity is going through at this time, or basically like the different existential risks that occur when humanity is bumping up against planetary boundaries and in creating accelerating technology or exponential technologies. So basically, you can kind of think of it as like AI alignment, climate change, nuclear proliferation, biodiversity collapse. There's just a bunch of microplastics in the oceans. There's a bunch of different existential risks to humanity that are caused by various different things. And the meta crisis from Daniel's frame is, how do we steward the unprecedented power of exponential technologies, and how do we look at the underlying causes of all of these different coordination failures and try to solve them at the root, at the generator functions, is what Daniel would call them, of those crises, as opposed to trying to solve each of these crises individually. So Daniel's way more articulate than I am, I think, in describing the meta crisis. And check out the Green Pill podcast with Daniel Schmachtenberger if you want to get a full 2-hour overview of the Metacrisis. Listening to Daniel is like it's just so intellectually rich. It's like the intellectual equivalent of a rich chocolate cake for me to listen to him speak. And if you want to get a full, well-rounded view of the Metacrisis, check out Daniel Schmachtenberger's interviews on the Green Pill podcast. If you just search his name on YouTube, you'll find some really great stuff. But yeah, Metacrisis is just all the different X risks that are facing humanity, and how can we wisely steward the unprecedented power of exponential technologies is sort of the design space. Yeah, Chris, what does that bring up for you?
Yeah, it's I think you're right. Like the rich chocolate cake analogy, I love that so much. It really is. There's so much ground covered in that podcast, and I would really encourage everyone to go and check it out. I wanted to kind of double click a bit on the responses to the Metacrisis. So you've done a really good job at laying out what the Metacrisis is, and alongside that, one of the things Daniel talks about is this term, the third attractor. I'm wondering if you could double click a bit on that and kind of share your understanding on what that is.
Yeah, for sure. The third attractor is about how do we solve these problems while avoiding the twin failure modes of catastrophes and dystopias. Okay, so an attractor is something that augments human behavior, and basically you can sort of think of the third attractor as searching for an attractor, something that augments human behavior to solve these problems that avoids the failure modes of the first two attractors, which are catastrophes and dystopias. So basically, you can sort of think of catastrophes as a coordination failure. If I am the mayor of a town, or I'm the government of a town, and I discover that there is a company in town that is polluting the ocean with runoff from an externality of its production process. Let's just say it's microplastics in the oceans or something like that. Then basically solving for that catastrophe, for that coordination failure, for that pollution, would involve regulation and using the power of government to solve that catastrophe. So that's one example of a catastrophe. It would be like runoff from the production process, industrial production process, into a river or an ocean. But there's other catastrophes that are caused more by distributed sets of actors, and one example of that is climate change. So basically, we all have an incentive to pursue our life's dreams and life works and our own agendas, and as a result of that, we burn fossil fuels, which externalizes harm to the rest of humanity. So there's 6 billion humans on the planet, and they're all generating some amount of carbon into the atmosphere, which over time accumulates existential risk to humanity. But from the point of view of every individual agent, it makes rational economic sense to externalize that harm and pursue their goals. So basically, catastrophes are the side effects, the externalities that come from people pursuing their own agenda. And the first attractor is catastrophe. Uncoordinated humans lead to coordination failures. And that leads to the second catastrophe, which is dystopia. So basically, what happens when you try to regulate all of humanity and their externalities, with, let's say, a global regulation on climate change, or even locally with that example I gave of a company polluting the rivers or the oceans. You get basically a government that is regulating you, and one of the problems with this is that, at least in the West, we've learned to trust our government. I think there's definitely parts of the world where there's varying degrees of trust in government. And once you give someone the ability to regulate you on one issue, you give them sort of root access to regulate you on all issues. And that's the second attractor, which is dystopia. Okay, so the first attractor is catastrophe, and the second attractor is when you try to regulate catastrophes, you get dystopias, which is authoritarian governments, people who have root power over you. So the third attractor would be, how can we solve coordination failures without creating dystopias? And so Daniel, when he looks at basically how do you solve for catastrophes without creating dystopias, that's what he calls the third attractor. And then I'll just layer in on top of the third attractor line of thinking. One of Daniel's other themes is that there's this exponentially exponential progression of technologies over centuries. So basically, if you think about sticks and stones to swords, to sword riders on horsebacks, to guns, to tanks, to atomic bombs, and now like AI, cyber warfare, there's exponential technologies. And so basically, 1,000 years ago, there wasn't existential risk to humanity because there was no global civilization with technologies that were powerful enough to destroy everyone. But now, because of the exponential acceleration of technology, it's actually more urgent to solve this third attractor thing because the whole planet is on the line. And so, yeah, first attractor solving catastrophe, second attractor solving dystopia, third attractor is solving for catastrophes and dystopias at the same time. And then there's sort of this like exponential, unprecedented power of technologies that's layered on top of it. So I always feel bad trying to like summarize Daniel's thoughts because he's really much more of an articulate speaker than I am. But that's my shot at it. Chris, what's your reaction to that?
I think you nailed it, man. That was really succinct. So let me just see if I understand. Tell me if I picked
Let's
this
go
up
for it.
correctly. So on the one hand, we have the first attractor, which could be collapse into chaos.
Yeah,
And on
catastrophes
the
is what Daniel would call it.
catastrophe. On the other hand, we've got dystopia, which could be kind of centralized tyranny, command and control, trying to dominate and control the environment to address the negative externalities that have kind of arisen as a result of the systems, the modern systems that our civilizations based upon. So you've got these two poles, and then there's this third option, the third attractor, which is trying to not fall into either chaos on the one hand or tyranny on the other, and find a third option.
Yep.
Is that, have I understood correctly?
Yeah, that's basically it. And then you layer on the fact that there's exponential progress of technologies, and we have the ability to destroy each other, which we've never really had. Then you sort of like layer that on top, and I think that's like sort of the totality of the first couple episodes that I did with Daniel.
Yeah. Cool. So one of the things that I'm often left considering when I kind of engage with this Metacrisis stuff is like, is it just about sense making? Like, is it just a movement to try and make sense of what's going on in the world, or is there some space here for like innovation, hacking, making, building, and like responding in that way?
I think it's a yes and. One of the things that came out during my episodes with Daniel is that he says a problem that's well understood is half addressed. So basically, the sense making part of it is half of the battle towards actually designing solutions. Daniel doesn't even like the word solutions. He likes to say that we're addressing the meta crisis and that we'll never completely solve it because it's such a wicked problem. But I think that sense making is definitely a prerequisite, and but it's only half the battle.
Cool. So if we're thinking about like, obviously there's the exponential tech curve and like the kind of negative externalities that are associated with that. I'm just curious, like from your perspective, where do you think like Web3 and just also tech in general might fit into like responding to the meta crisis?
Well, I mean, I think that there's two major schools of thought that are debating these things these days. There's the EAC movement and its various forks, and then there's the decel movement and its various forks. And so basically the two major schools of thinking here are effective acceleration, which is basically we need to accelerate into the progress narrative and create even more technology to solve the problems that technology is creating on a increasing exponential curve. And there's forks of that called, like Vitalik wrote a post about DAC, which stands for defensive acceleration, where basically we try to accelerate the defensive technologies instead of the offensive technologies. That's one school of thinking. And then the other school of thinking is the decel thinking, which is basically unwind all of this technology, regulate AI, regulate nuclear proliferation, and like really try to go back to a declining population and decelerating technological progress to get this all under control. And so those are the two lines of thinking with respect to how to solve all of these different problems. I would say that Web3 is probably somewhere within the EAC, DAC space in terms of using 21st century technologies to solve 21st century problems. But I would caution against solutionism, which I would define as like being a solution looking for a problem. I think that the best solutions will be one part demand and one part supply, and we should avoid just kind of like going around with like Bitcoin fixes this or crypto fixes this as a mindset as we pursue these things. But yeah, TLDR, EAC versus decel, I think, are the two main ways of thinking about this problem set.
Cool. So I'm thinking about this in terms of like on the tech side, and thinking about the sort of the rise of Web 2 and this whole kind of idea that we need to like move fast and break things and like just like play with technology, and maybe Facebook was one kind of the end state of some of that experimentation. Would you say that the Metacrisis approach is like kind of cautioning against that, or is there still space for like messing around, experimenting, maybe making some mistakes? Like how do you think that we kind of balance out those like the existential risk whilst also leaving room for experimentation?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that Vitalik's take on forking EAC and making it into DAC, which is basically defensive accelerationism, is very profound, which is basically if we can prioritize defensive technologies and make sure that defensive tools are the ones that are exponentially accelerating, then basically what we're doing is hardening people against terrorism and state-sponsored violence and things of those nature. And so I think that that's like a really interesting way to think about these things. I think that, but on the counterpoint, I think the devil is in the details with respect to how do you tell what's going to be a defensive technology versus an offensive technology when you're early in R&D. I think that like that's just not the way that R&D works. It's like you can't say early in the process, oh, this could only be used defensively, and therefore allocate money and research time to it. So that's like the one area where I'd push back on Vitalik's DAC vision. But I think that like but the second answer to your question is that I don't really know, and I think that a lot of my approach to this problem space and to what I'm doing here is just sort of recognizing the limits of my own knowledge and my own ability to address these problems. And one of the things that I've started to do is use my profile as the founder of Gitcoin to just sort of accelerate the sense making conversation about these things such that bigger brains than me can be set up in order to solve them. I mean, in some ways, this comes back to Gitcoin's mission, which is to fund what matters. In what ways can we build sense-making tools that help fund the most interesting projects that are helping to address the meta crisis? And then it becomes like a decentralized collective intelligence thing, not just like, what's Kevin's vision? And so, yeah, I think that that's the second way that I'm thinking about it is basically upregulating the people who are actually working on solving these or addressing these problems in earnest out there. And there's lots of engaged, really smart people in the Web3 space and in the technology space that I think are going to eventually help us get our heads around the problem. So a couple different approaches there, but that's where my head's at.
Yeah, I love that. I love that the conversations kind of come back to Gitcoin and stuff, and I'm thinking a bit about coordination failure, and coordination failure being at the heart of the meta crisis, and the need to kind of respond to that. And I'm wondering if there's some link here with like how we allocate capital, whether there's a use for Web3 here to kind of address some of those coordination failures at that level.
For sure, there is. So basically, after my conversation with Daniel, I did three podcast episodes with Daniel. The first was just what is the meta crisis. The second was how do we even start to think about addressing the meta crisis? Like where the f do we even start? And then the third podcast episode I did with Daniel was announcing something called Metacrisis DAO. So basically, the idea here was, hey, can crypto play a hand in helping to address the meta crisis? I mean, the third attractor, to me, it sounds a fucking lot like crypto to me. Basically, solving coordination failures, but without giving someone root access, is the same problem as what smart contracts and DAOs are supposed to solve, at least in theory. So we basically launched this thing called Metacrisis DAO back in, I think it's like 2022, 2023, something like that, and had a lot of really interesting discussions of people who were taking different approaches to starting to address the meta crisis. And then I'd say things piddled out / got like a little bit too, oh, I don't know. Like there's a bunch of reasons why Metacrisis DAO didn't really work out and didn't really fully become a DAO. But the alumni network from Metacrisis DAO is still in touch to these days and working on new versions of how to address the problem. And but yeah, the reductionist answer to your question is yes. I think that Web3 is extremely well positioned to play a role in solving this in the 21st century, assuming we go down the EAC-DEAC route of solving these problems.
Cool. And is there anything like that you've learned from that process that you would share with like other DAOs that are kind of playing around in this space? I'm thinking about like VDAO is sort of experimenting in this space and like trying to bring in the elements of kind of innovation in the physical world as well and experimenting with regenerative network states and stuff. What advice would you give to DAOs that are kind of trying to experiment in this meta crisis space?
Yeah, that's a great question. I feel like not even really well equipped to answer it. I mean, who am I? I have a software engineering degree, and you know, all this like complex political system stuff. Sometimes it feels like it's beyond me, but you know, I'll take a swing at it just out of good faith, but just like take my answer with a grain of salt, knowing that I'm not as like lucid and articulate as Daniel. But yeah, so I mean, I think that one of the things that I think Metacrisis DAO didn't really work out was because like I think over time it just became like Metacrisis DAO became sort of like this forum where everyone had these big ideas about how to solve the meta crisis, and I feel like everyone was like trying to be Daniel Schmachtenberger, like Daniel Schmachtenberger 2.0 in the Meta Crisis DAO, and over time it just kind of felt like it became like big brains talking past each other and like the loudest voice wins and stuff like that, and it like the vibe just like I felt like it didn't really go anywhere. And so like one of the things that I'm personally spending more time on is like instead of solving it at the meta level, how could we solve it at the object level? How can we prioritize the people who are actually doing the on the ground, like hand to soil work that is going to be required to solve these problems? And that's one of the things that attracted me to VDAO is that you guys aren't like, you know, big brain, like trying to solve like you're not trying to be like a Daniel Schmachtenberger. You're actually trying to build regenerative network states where we're prioritizing community and permaculture and things of that nature. And I think that starting local but thinking global is a great way to start to address these things. And the next tranche of projects that I'm going to spend my time and money on are going to be working more in that way, as opposed to like, you know, the sort of like abstract philosophical way of thinking about things. There's other ways I could take that, but I'll pause there and see what that brings up for you.
Yeah, I think it's really helpful actually because like in a way like we need the sense making, right? Like we need the big brain thinking, like that's really important. But then there comes a question like what do we do with that? And that's a journey in itself, right? So I really appreciate you sharing your learning and your experience, because this is all part of feeding into like how do we take this forward, how do we experiment and like try and find solutions that are like meaningful solutions. And I know you said that Daniel doesn't really like that word. What's an alternative word to solutions?
I mean,
Response?
I think he says addressing it, because like a solution, it
okay.
sounds like it's like the full answer, whereas addressing it is just like starting to get your head around it. But yeah, and the other thing I'll respond to is that you said that sense making is absolutely necessary, and I think that that's true. I think that we already have Daniel Schmachtenberger, though. We don't need like more Daniel Schmachtenbergers. So that's where Metacrisis DAO went wrong, and I think like now that his vision is out there, people should start digesting it and actually coming up with ways to address these problems. Would be what I would like to see.
Yeah, sounds good. So you mentioned in there, and I've mentioned this as well about like regenerative network states, this term, and the approach that we're taking within VDAO. I'm wondering, like, what are your thoughts on that? Like, what are your thoughts on this term? Like, is it just a kind of fantasy, like a neo-libertarian fantasy, this network state thing, like this regenerative network state thing? Like, what's your take on this?
Well, I'd say that I've become kind of interested in permaculture these days. Like permaculture to me feels like regenerative agriculture, and for that reason, I think it's really interesting to me. But I'd say that I'm like purely in the LARPing stages of being excited about permaculture. Like I'm not actually practicing it at this time, but I want to. It's like one of my intents later in life to start messing around with permaculture, and I think the network state movement is interesting / scary in different ways. And one of the things that I like to do with new technologies and new movements is just sort of mess around with them and start playing with them and start understanding the ideas and building relationships. And that's kind of the state that I'm in with VDAO and adjacent spaces. And so I think that that's a long way of saying I don't really know yet, but I'm interested to find out over the coming years and curious to see what VDAO comes up with.
Sounds good. Yeah, I think like the permaculture, you mentioned permaculture there. Like, there's so many tools that like that movement's been around since the 70s, right? It's been evolving and developing in that time, and there's so much knowledge already out there about how to kind of design for land, design regenerative properties. Like, there's a lot of stuff out there that we can learn from, similar to the sense making that Daniel's been doing in the kind of more academic sphere. There's a lot of on the ground learning that we can take from permaculture, regen ag, and I would see all that as feeding into these experiments in the regenerative network state space. And I think it's just about like jumping in, experimenting, and learning peer to peer. Cool. So I'm curious, like, if there's any aspect of that we kind of I'll probably open up to some questions from people that are in the spaces shortly, but is there any aspect of this discussion, Kevin, you wanted to like double click on or like explore in more detail?
The other aspect that I don't think that we've covered, which I think is interesting and also sort of intersects with my work, is how are we going to fund what matters in these communities in the 21st century? And the original vision for Gitcoin was to help DAOs fund what matters to them. But I think that increasingly the stuff that we're inventing for DAOs could be used by local communities. And I'm really excited for a world in which quadratic funding and retroactive public goods funding are not just used by DAOs, but are used by like individual city states and regenerative network states in order to help them fund what matters to them. So I'll just say that like the area where I'm bringing this stuff into practice tends to be in Gitcoin's work, which is building capital allocation for the 21st century. And maybe the object level work that you guys are doing with the regenerative network states of VDAO is like an important component, but I also think that like Gitcoin's mission intersects with this also, and that's where I'm spending a lot of my time is on Gitcoin 2.1 and Gitcoin 2.2 and making sure that all works. But yeah, let's bring it up. Let's bring people up on stage and start doing more community engagement. Excited for that.
Sounds good. Yeah, if is anyone, I think we've got 2 requests so far, Ben, right? Hello, Ben.
Yeah, it looks like we've got 2 requests. I'm gonna go ahead and bring them up. Citizen, if you want to put your request back in again, I saw you just dropped, but maybe your question has been answered. Looks like Landon and Steph. So we'll bring up both Landon and then Steph.
Cool. Hey guys, welcome. Do you have a question for Kevin or just comment generally on the spaces? Go ahead, Steph.
Hey, Kevin. Thanks for being here. I'm curious about capital deployment or DAOs raising money to be able to do kind of the full stack of permaculture, decentralized governance, all of that. So my situation is I participate in VDAO, I participate in Spirit DAO. I think you know Ron Rivers, Spirit DAO. And I have a 3-acre plot of land, and the question is, one, I want to donate it to a DAO, and we're working in Spirit DAO to do that, which is set up as a nonprofit religious institution, which is pending. I think I brought up the question in VDAO, which was, how does VDAO receive donations? And I think I'm curious if you know of what the best kind of mechanism for receiving donations are, so that the DAO that is the expertise at doing permaculture or whatever it is capable of operating it, and they're, you know, like the land actually develops and benefits, and it's not necessarily for people to gain wealth from, but for us to kind of trend in a certain lifestyle. So curious if you can speak about any of the like capital allocation, donation, the right structures, various thoughts on that type of thing.
Yeah, I think that's great that you want to do that. I'm curious to see how that goes if you do that. I have nothing smart to add though. Unfortunately, maybe Chris will. I would love to see concerned citizens starting to get involved in that way. And so I support you in spirit, but I don't have anything smart to add here. Chris, you got any ideas?
Yeah, in terms of like land purchase or land donations to DAOs and donations in general to DAOs, like I think it's something that within VDAO we're still figuring out, and we've got a pod working on this at the moment to try and explore how can the DAO spin up kind of community hubs in local areas, specifically focusing on autonomous regenerative properties. And there's a whole kind of regulatory piece to this as well, which is a bigger conversation, kind of industry-wide thing. But yeah, we're still figuring it out. But hopefully, in the coming months and years, we'll get to a point where we can see that happen, because that's really crucial within VDAO and also DAOs in general within this space, that there's this link between the digital and the physical. Landon, did you have a question for Kevin? Hello, Landon, are you there? Go ahead.
I'm not
Did we
hearing
lose
anything.
Landon?
It might just be me.
Yeah, I think we lost Landon. I think we've got another couple of requests, Ben. Does anyone else have any questions, comments for Kevin? Or any questions, comments related to the Metacrisis topic in general?
We did have Civil request, but then I went to go ahead and accept his request, but it seems he may have dropped out. Civil, I see you're back in here again now. If you have a question, please send me a request and we'll bring you up. Otherwise, Landon, if you've kind of got your microphone situation figured out, or figured out the connection issue, please go ahead with your question.
I think while we're waiting, Kevin, just another kind of question I'd throw out there is, like, in terms of this relationship with Gitcoin and the real world, have you done any experiments with that in the past, with like using Gitcoin funding, using quadratic funding with local groups? Anything that you'd like to share from your experiences there?
Yeah, happy to. In 2020, we did a quadratic a quadratic funding experiment in downtown Boulder, Colorado, to help fund businesses that had been had basically lost a lot of their foot traffic because of the COVID pandemic, and we were able to distribute about $50K worth of quadratic funding in downtown Boulder, Colorado, through normies, no Web3 involved. And so, what was really exciting for that about that for me was that we proved out that quadratic funding works locally. It's not just Web3 nerds and mechanism design nerds that it works for. It actually works in local communities. The psychology of give $1 and this project gets a couple $100, depending on how many people are contributing to it. Like that works outside of the Web3 bubble. And I think that that's really exciting for me to prove that these mechanisms can go mainstream, even if it's at a very small scale at this time. But yeah, that campaign was called Downtown Stimulus, and I'm thinking about doing a talk about that at DevCon this year. So excited to see more experiments like that pop up in the coming months and years, as hopefully the UX of crypto becomes a little bit easier to do, but also as we invent more capital allocation mechanisms that just work for the 21st century. So yeah, that was a really fun experiment. Thanks for asking.
I love that. I'm excited to see how that develops, and also maybe kind of how it might link into bioregionalism in the future as we try and like spin up local groups to kind of regenerate bioregions. I think capital allocation is going to be crucial in that. So
Yeah.
Excited to hear. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. I was just also really excited, and you just brought up bioregions, which I'm very excited about as a sort of fulcrum in order to experiment with a lot of these public goods funding tools. The shout out to Todd Youngblood and Ben Life, who I'm in talks with to do a season on bioregionalism on the Green Pill podcast in the coming months. I think that there's a lot of opportunity to leverage bioregions in order to bring a lot of these public goods funding mechanisms mainstream, and also to begin really working on Metacrisis stuff in the 21st century. So shout out to Todd and Ben for working on that.
Sounds great. So we've got another couple of speakers come forward. Civil, did you have a question for Kevin? You can come ahead and unmute yourself.
Hello, hello. Is it working?
Yeah, welcome.
Hello, amazing. Yeah, I always have questions for Kevin. Yeah, so one thing that I'm always or oftentimes thinking about is kind of the allocation of focus, because there are a lot of like visionaries and a lot of people with amazing ideas and on different levels for different things, and especially kind of considering maybe the difference in landscape from 10 years ago and now. Like obviously there are a bunch of different initiatives and also a bunch of initiatives with overlap, which is on the one hand great for decentralization and also natural in decentralized thinking and in a decentralized approach. But on the other hand, for coordination, you maybe don't want monopolies, but having like 1,000 different tiny teams with like all more than 50% of the activity overlapping also doesn't seem like the most efficient way of going about it. So like how do you think about like people trying to build some or wanting to build something that either already exists that they might be aware of or they might not be aware of, and of course everybody's approach is different, and just the people that are doing it is also making it different already, even though the thing might be the same. Yeah, how do you think about that? What do you recommend to people when they come to you and you're like, oh well, I know this exists? Like, yeah, how do you think about those kind of conversations? And
yeah. Well, I mean, I think that my first answer is just one of being humble. Like, I really don't know what I don't know, and I'm just very mindful that I don't have the answers. And I think that like the best thing I can do is try to. What I would really like to do is speed run the discovery and the exploration of the problem space. And one part of speedrunning the problem space is to be learning. We should all be aware of the solutions that have been tried in the past, and we should be trying to learn from them and leverage them in our in the way that we're advancing our initiatives these days. And on the other hand, sometimes there can be attempts to a problem that are just too early, and they just don't work because they're too early. And in some sense, like, think about Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook. Social networks have been tried a bunch before, and they never really worked before, but just the timing was right and the execution was right for him. I mean, I think there's a lot of problems with with Facebook and the way it was conceived, and it externalizes harm these days. But as an entrepreneurial story itself, I think that it's a great example of trying something new with better execution and it actually working out. So I don't know the answer, but I'm trying to facilitate a group of people that think it's cool and really exciting to explore the design space. And I think that we're going to let 1,000 experiments blossom. And I have no idea which ones are going to be the ones that win, but I think that most projects won't work out, but there's going to be a couple of projects with exponential upside that end up defining the entire category for everyone else. And I would love to see over the next 5 to 10 years, those people be very, very successful. And when they start to appear and they start to exist, I'm going to play a role in hopefully amplifying them through Gitcoin, and also through my role as podcast host at the Green Pill podcast. So maybe a long way of saying I don't really know, but I'm here to fuck around and find out.
Yeah, no, I feel that. That makes sense. And of course, there's no perfect answer, but just like for me, for instance, I like recently I thought like, okay, we have like, I don't know, 10 kind of known and more or less active, and then maybe like at least 20 different sort of crypto donation platforms. All of that are different, but I'm like, okay, there's a bunch of resources, time and energy and money which is flown into all of them, and that those resources have not gone into the actual causes, right? And so that's kind of one of the things where I'm coming from. Is like, okay, we need infrastructure, right? But also, if we're just focusing on the infrastructure, it's like we're building infrastructure to build SaaS systems to support builders so that they can build tools for the next tech stack, so that we then can build a social stack that then can be interoperable with an execution layer for different infrastructure that is helpful for this and that. So like there's so many different layers, and yeah, that's kind of the, I guess, the inefficiencies to come from intention to impact is like building is nice, but sometimes there's like an overbuilding from my perception.
Cool. Thanks a lot for your question and your thoughts, Sivo. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to move on to the next question. MZ, did you want to come in?
Yeah. Thanks, Kevin, for being here. I really like the example of, not the example actually, the pilot that you mentioned about, using quadratic funding with non-Web3 people. And I think when I think about like how do we bring in the next, like, the famous question, the next billion users, right? The non-Web3 users and participants. I think public funding and funding public goods is a big one that a lot of people would be interested in. So what I'm curious about is if you have any data or any insights to share in terms of like, how many or what's the percentage of non-Web3 people joining Gitcoin rounds? How is it looking? What can we do there to make it more and more accessible outside of just like the crypto crowds?
Yeah, great question. Gitcoin has not been focused here, and we don't have a ton of traction with getting outside of the Web3 space. I want to give a shout out to Giveth, who is also a quadratic funding platform and has been focused way more on people who are not Web3 natives. So there's people out there that are working on it, and I think have more traction than Gitcoin. And so check out Giveth if you're into that stuff.
Sorry if it was mentioned before, but the specific example in Greece where a QF round was run in person, or like for local community, like, is there any more information where people can learn about how that was done with the local government? that was super, super interesting. I feel like that's kind of underappreciated in the Web3 for Good space.
Sorry, which example was that? Did you say in Greece?
I'm pretty sure, yeah. Sarah Bergsman from previously from Region Network posted about it a while ago. I'll find the exact mention, but from my understanding, it was kind of a collaboration between Funding the Commons and Gitcoin and a few other organizations, like at least one local DAO. Of a city in Greece that kind of where local government had implemented QF.
Okay, got it. Yeah, I'm curious to learn more about that. It's possible that Gitcoin's decentralized and now I think is done on the order of like 200 rounds, so it's possible I just don't know about it. But yeah, if you can dig anything up, I'd be curious to learn more and see what we can learn about these things. And I think at some point, bringing these technologies mainstream is going to be a whole category, and maybe I'll do a whole Green Pill episode about people taking these technologies and movements mainstream, and we can learn about them as a category. But for now, it's nice to see these little sprouts of innovation popping up, and I think that I would love to play a role in accelerating that and upregulating those. So let me know if you find anything about them.
Cool. KT, you've got your hand up. Did you have a question for Kevin?
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, we can.
Okay,
Welcome.
okay, thank you. So a lot of people are worried about AI alignment, and when you look at I've kind of noticed a bottleneck in the funding process for AI alignment. When you look at grants around AI and AI alignment, the vast majority of them, I would say nearly all of them, revolve around iterating on current technology rather than some kind of moonshot project that would, say, invent a new kind of AI. So AI alignment specifically refers to getting your models to align with your desired output. And it assumes that you already have an AI engine. It doesn't take into account that somebody might be making a new type of AI where the models are human readable. So there's just no funding for these kind of moonshot projects outside of, say, DARPA. DARPA funds this kind of stuff. And I'm just wanting to point it out to people that there is this bottleneck that's slowing down our research and solving these kind of problems. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I think that you pointed out some important problems there, and one of the things that, by the way, like, I'm not an expert in AI. I never pivoted to AI when it became hot, and I barely understand matrix multiplication. But I think that one of the problems with AI alignment is that you really see this concentration of power around who has capital. It takes a ton of compute power in order to train AI models, and then it also takes a ton of talent. You basically have to pay like $500K a year to keep an AI engineer on board these days because the market is so competitive for them. And this creates these sort of centralizing effects where, in order to really be a player in the AI space, then you have to have these concentrated capital. But then, there's the other hand where people are starting to really open source AI models and tweak them. I think that, like, counterintuitively, Facebook and Meta have been on the forefront of open source AI. And so democratizing access has its own benefits, but also its own issues. What happens when you open source AI and a terrorist group is running a local AI model in order to engineer a perfect bioweapon? Like, that shit is scary as fuck. And so, yeah, I'm not sure that I really have the answer to the AI alignment problem, but I do think that, if we can solve the catastrophe without creating the dystopia, then that's probably where, I don't want to put words in Daniel Schmachtenberger's mouth, but using his framework, that's where my mind goes in terms of trying to start addressing these problems. Appreciate you bringing it up, and thanks for coming up on stage and saying that.
Thanks a lot, Katie. I'm conscious of time, so I'm just going to begin wrapping things up. But thanks to everyone who came forward with questions for Kevin. I just want to, before we close out, I just want to give Kevin an opportunity to kind of add any last thoughts that you want to add, Kevin. Maybe also a good opportunity to show your book, which is your latest book, which is really good, by the way, and I would recommend everyone go and check out on capital allocation, which definitely has a key role in building through the Metacrisis. So, Kevin, any last thoughts, comments that you want to add before we wrap?
I mean, I think the primary one is that as a kid, I used to worry about climate change, and it was really lonely and sort of like sad to feel like it was hopeless to worry about it alone. And you know, I'm still worried about climate change, and you know, now I have kids of my own, and I worry about what the world's going to be like when they're my age. And you know, I think that it's a time of crisis, maybe meta crisis, but I think that the fact that we're trying to solve it together is something that brings me a lot of hope, and it feels less lonely now. So just thank you to everyone who showed up to the space and is working on this hard problem. I think that I'm going to try to play a role in which I'm helping people synthesize how to think about the problem and upregulating what I think of as the most earnest and promising ways of solving the or I guess Daniel would say addressing the meta crisis. And that's why I agreed to do this panel with you, Chris. I think that VDAO is onto something, and you know, curious to see what it evolves into. One of the ways that I think that I can help is by democratizing the access and the knowledge that I have as the founder of Gitcoin that other people might not have. And so I wrote a book. It's called the On-Chain Capital Allocation Handbook. You can get it at allobook.gitcoin.co. Thank you for pinning it on the banner of the Twitter space. And basically, my hypothesis is that we're going to be able to solve for the third attractor using on-chain capital allocation. Okay, so we can solve coordination failures with coordination technology, which I would say Ethereum is, and we can do it without creating dystopias. And that's what makes me really excited about working in Ethereum and smart contracts every day. So if you want to learn more about what I've learned, then you can check out the Allo book at allobook.gitcoin.co, and curious to get your feedback once you read it. Thanks so much for hosting the space, Chris. This has been a lot of fun. And like I said, it warms my heart to be working on these hard problems with all of you. Thank you so much for showing up every day and doing what you do.
Thanks so much, Kevin. It's really been a great conversation, and it feels like the start of further conversations to come. Really loved your book and would recommend that everyone in the spaces checks it out. Thanks to everyone else who joined today and everyone who came forward with questions. We're going to be announcing very soon. There'll be more information coming out that we're going to do a guest Green Pill podcast on regenerative network states coming up in October. We're really excited about that. Also, next month for our Twitter Spaces, we've got Marek from Cello Labs joining us for a conversation on building for the long term, which we're really excited about as well. So yeah, thanks so much for joining the Spaces today. If you want to get more involved with VDAO, come hang out in the Discord. We'd love to chat. And yeah, thanks a lot, guys.
Thanks for hosting. Bye, everyone. Peace and love.
Bye, everybody. Take care.